of enough carbohydrates, enough fats, enough protein, enough vegetables and fruits. And only then, when everything is in order, you start talking about supplements. Because supplements are not going to make you a world champion, but a poor diet, like unbalanced diet, can really deteriorate your performance. So when we talk about sports nutrition, we are talking actually about the same principle, almost the same principles as the healthy diet that is recommended to your parents or whoever in this planet. So I'll talk about this in the beginning. So like, what are the basics? And the most important part of your diet, in my opinion, are carbohydrates. They provide you with energy. And in these days, many people think that carbohydrates are making us fat, which in my opinion is very untrue. And basically carbohydrates, because they provide you with energy, are the crucial part of your athlete's diet. And this is the part that actually varies the most. They are like a nutrient that your body can actually live without. This means that if you go to the low carbohydrate diet, you will normally survive, you will just be hungry and your performance would suffer. But that's it. But for optimal performance, the carbohydrates are an essential part of your diet, as I will show you later on. What I want to say is that carbohydrate intake varies depending on the activity level. So now, as you are not training a lot, you're mostly sedentary, watching Netflix, doing nothing, you don't need a lot of carbohydrates. So you don't need a lot of energy and carbohydrates as well. So you can actually survive on like 200 grams of pasta per day. Whereas when you have a really long training session with Sail Coach or in Malta, perhaps a double day, and it's blowing, the wind is really strong, you can actually need even more than a kilogram of dry pasta a day. So the needs actually change and vary according to the weather, to the demands of the training session, to the demands of the race. And you have to keep that in mind. I'll return to this a bit later on, but I just wanted to give you an overview of how carbohydrates needs change based on the intensity. If you decided to take a screenshot of this or a photo, please know that these numbers are like really rough, because everything depends on the training status of the individual. So those numbers are really, really like crude estimation. So don't take them for granted. The next macronutrients that provide us with energy are actually fat. So fats, being different to carbohydrates, are an essential part of the human diet. That means that we have to ingest fats in order to stay healthy. For example, hormones are made of fat. So this means that if we do not ingest enough fat in our diet, basically we can actually suffer from hormonal disturbances, and this can lead into severe problems. For example, cyclists are known to have such problems, or like marathon runners as well. And I'm pretty sure that for some sailors this applies as well. So a general rule of thumb would be to have at least 1 gram of fat per kilogram of body weight. So that equates like to 70, 80 grams or 60 to 70, depending on your body weight. That's not a lot of fat if you compare this number to carbohydrates, but still it's an essential part of your diet. So you don't want to ingest foods that are really high in fat, so like fatty meat or a lot of cheese, because that fat is basically non-essential. We know 2 types of fats. Some are essential. Those are called also healthy fats. You probably heard of that term, and you know what belongs to healthy fats, like olive oil, avocado, fish, and stuff like that, that contains omega-3 mainly, that are really good sources of fat. And you can actually ingest or supplement your diet with omega-3 if you are unsure if you're having enough fat in your diet. So like some seeds, nuts are all good sources of fats, and that should be probably a part of your diet. But at the same time, you want to minimize the amount of high-fat cheese or high-fat dairy products, meat, and stuff like that, because that's not something that you want to ingest. Because what happens at the end of the day is, if you increase your fat intake, you have to decrease your carbohydrate intake if you want to stay in balance. So that's kind of the general rule. In terms of fats versus carbohydrates, there is always a debate what's more important, what's essentially essential for the athlete. So I'll just give a 3 parameter comparison between fats and carbohydrates, so that you will understand why both nutrients are really important, but that carbohydrates are really important for athletes. So we'll talk about efficiency, so how much energy we can get from gram or of carbohydrates or fats. We'll talk about the stores, how much of carbohydrates or fats we can store, and the ability to perform high intensity efforts. So you all know that you've probably heard of the term VO2 max, which is maximal oxygen uptake. And you've heard that oxygen uptake actually is a good indicator of your overall training status. So oxygen is basically required for aerobic metabolism. This is the metabolism that you can sustain forever. You're breathing heavily, you can go for hours. And fats and carbohydrates differ in how efficiently you can use this oxygen. And actually, you can get more energy per liter of oxygen if you're using carbohydrates as compared to fats. This is something that's not really commonly cited or told to athletes, but when they made a calculation for like marathon runners, 42 kilometers, around 2 hours run, they've calculated that you can improve your time by like 40 seconds, which is substantial if you increase your carbohydrate oxidation rate and decrease fat oxidation rates. So this is really important when you're doing like the last leg of your race and you are just trying to win a race. So here, carbohydrates are really important and the clear winner. The next thing are stores. So how the body's ability to store carbohydrates and fats varies greatly. For example, for carbohydrates, we can only store about 2,000 calories. That's like a regatta and a half, probably, of really high intensity, a long regatta, and not enough for a really long training session. Whereas fats, we have 80,000 calories on an average human, which is plenty to cover daily needs for a few days. And fats are a clear winner here, obviously. And this kind of says and means that you have to have an ability to utilize carbohydrates when the carbohydrates are needed. So high intensity efforts because they're more efficient, but at the same time, fats are really important for a lower intensity work. And like during recovery, you actually have the ability to use fat. And then the last comparison is ability to perform high intensity efforts. So like doing 3-minute all out, like hiking at the end of the upwind leg. The gusts are really strong and you just have to push as hard as you can. You cannot utilize fats for that because fats actually require you to have enough oxygen supply, and there is not enough oxygen at high intensity efforts. So the only way you can produce or get energy is from carbohydrate metabolism, because carbohydrate metabolism, one part of it does not require oxygen. So carbohydrates are crucial for performing high intensity efforts. So that's the reason why we have to have carbohydrates in our diets, and it's also the reason, the small stores of carbohydrates, that's also the reason why we have to ingest enough carbohydrates prior to the race, so for breakfast, the previous day, and also during the regatta or the racing day or training day on the water. Whereas for fats, we have those stores enough. So basically, if you would stop eating any fats during a few days regatta, that would probably be perfectly fine. So the carbohydrates are the most important part of your diet during intensive efforts and intensive racing days. I haven't spoken anything about, I haven't mentioned proteins yet. So the proteins are the third macronutrient. So macronutrients are those three nutrients that we consume in a relatively large quantities. So proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. So proteins are not used for energy most of the time, but are essential for recovery and adaptations. For example, our muscles are made out of protein, and if there is no protein around, we cannot build or rebuild muscles after the training sessions. So proteins are key from that perspective. The other important thing to have in mind when talking about proteins is that we do not store proteins as we do carbohydrates and fats. So we cannot, when we eat proteins, we don't store them, we just use them, or just use them for building up or recovery, or we just basically use them for energy. So this means that we have to regularly consume protein so that the body has the protein available for rebuilding and repairing the muscles. So a general recommendation is to have at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight a day. This is a pretty small amount in my opinion. I would actually increase this to 2 grams to be on the safe side. And as I've mentioned, you cannot store protein. So that's the reason why the protein intake has to be distributed throughout the day. Ideally in equal amounts, at least 20-30 grams of protein per meal. And the most common mistake that athletes usually do is not to have protein for the breakfast, and they only have proteins post the first training session or the race. So the window when the body is recovering, the recovery mode is really small as a consequence. So you have to have protein for breakfast. If the first start of the day is like at 1 o'clock, have another protein meal before that, and then immediately when you come from the water again, and then dinner, and probably before sleep. You can also have some protein before sleep. So that's about it for protein. So I've talked about macronutrients now. The next thing are micronutrients, so those little small compounds that actually enable you to function. You can find them in like vegetables and fruits mostly, and they're an essential part of your diet. So some nutritionists would advise you to use multivitamins. I'm opposed to this idea because I think they can actually prevent training adaptations if you consume that in large quantities. So to be on the safe side, I think the best idea is to have fruits and vegetables in your diet. And the very basic rule is to have 1 piece of each of the rainbow colors every day. So you have an example here, what this means. Like 1 portion, basically, not 1 piece, 1 portion, so that you can actually get enough micronutrients. These are vitamins, minerals, and stuff like that. Only if your physician advises you to use vitamins, then you do, but otherwise I do not think they are necessary. You just need to make sure that you're eating enough fruits and vegetables. So that's about the basics. Now let's move on to looking at the weather forecast. Sailors are known for taking a look at the weather forecast days in advance. As a cyclist these days, I never look weather forecast. I just look at what is it going to be, sunny or cloudy or raining, or is it going to rain? And I'm not bothered if it's windy, although I hate wind at the moment, but as a sailor, you're mostly curious what's the wind going to be like. So looking at the weather forecast, you can actually expect what the training sessions are going to be like. So during light winds, the training sessions are probably going to be light, easy. It's going to be technique on the water. Your heart rate during training sessions is unlikely to be really high unless you're doing like techs in a row. Whereas in strong winds, those training sessions are really going to be demanding. So that's the plan you're actually making when you're deciding what to do in the water. But also this applies to nutrition as well. You start thinking at the same time about nutrition. So I've talked about the carbohydrates needs previously, I mean a few slides back, how much carbohydrates you need for a hard training session and how much carbohydrates you need for light, easy training session. And the difference is huge. So instead of looking at what you've done during the training session, so when you come ashore, okay, I've done a really hard training session, so I can eat now. You should be thinking what I'm going to do next. So not like going back, oh, I had a hard training session. You should be thinking what's coming next, what's going to happen. So about the forecast. So that's why I mentioned the weather forecast. So the same thing, so these colors, as light wind, red, strong winds, green, also means you can use this rule for carbohydrate needs. So if a hard training session is coming up, you need a lot of carbohydrates, little fat, so you increase your carbohydrate before these training sessions. So you will eat loads of rice, loads of pasta to top up your carbohydrate stores within the body. Whereas if a light training session is coming up, or like no, there is no wind forecasted, or you actually have a easy training day, no training day, a day off, your carbohydrate needs decrease, so you don't need to ingest them a lot, eat them, so you think about that in advance. So eat in line with the demands of the training sessions, or the race, or the regatta, whatever. So for example, here is a plan that you can actually make. So on day one, we have strong winds. We eat a lot of carbohydrates before the training session. Make sure that you eat plenty the day before. You make sure that the breakfast is big, that you have something on the water. So during the training session, I'll talk specifics in a bit. And then you take a look after the training session, what's coming next. It's going to be a light day, light winds, but a really long day on the water. So you still need a lot of energy for that, because being the whole day on the water means that you probably won't have ability to have like a proper meals during the day. So you kind of eat medium amount of carbohydrates, medium amount, you don't overeat, but you don't just like limit your intake too much. Again, on day 3, we have strong winds. So again, green color means loads of carbohydrates. After the second training, after the day 2, and then before the training session of that day, again, loads of carbohydrates. If it's just a gym session, for example, you don't need a lot of carbohydrates, you don't need a lot of energy, so you go really easy on the energy intake. So it's always about balancing. If you were to ingest the same amount of food approximately every single day, that would probably mean that you would be underfueled, so not have enough energy to perform really high intensity efforts, so high intensity races, regattas. That would mean that training sessions wouldn't be as effective, that you would be tired, you would not be able to train to do or execute proper technique on the water, so that would be a problem for you. On the same side, if you were to ingest too much energy during light days, that would probably in the long term mean weight gain, which you probably or shouldn't be worried too much about. Should be worried. You can be worried about. So that's about it. The next thing are what sources of foods are good. So here we have 3 examples of breakfast. So the left-hand side, that's like a usual breakfast, for example, for cyclists. Loads of carbohydrates. That's porridge. You can have something else as well, like bread or mostly carbohydrates. Is usually something that's recommended for breakfast. The problem with this example here is that it doesn't contain enough protein, so you have to have some source of protein as well on the top of that, like whey protein, shake or something like that. On the right hand side, you have British breakfast, English breakfast, which is the worst possible solution probably. It contains a lot of fat, like bacon, sausages, but relatively little carbohydrates, and that's not going to give you a lot of energy during the training day. On the bottom right hand side, you have a low carbohydrate breakfast. That's not going to give you any energy whatsoever for a training session. But you can see here there are eggs, there is avocado, there is salmon. So these are healthy fats, I would say. And this is actually a breakfast from Chris Froome on a rest day of the Tour de France a few years back. And this is kind of a recovery based breakfast. So he's suggesting the things that he hasn't ingested or eaten in the days during hard work. So the day after the regatta, you can probably optimally eat something like this to actually recover as quickly as possible. And because you're resting, you don't need a lot of carbohydrates. So in this case, there are no carbohydrates whatsoever. On the water, don't forget to eat. It doesn't really matter what it is. The most important thing is it's carbohydrates. So it doesn't matter if it's bars, if it's gels, if it's in liquid form like energy drinks, as soon as there are carbohydrates. One of the things important things is that you try the nutrition for the race before the race during the training session, so that you can actually find out what works best for you. Some prefer energy gels, some prefer like rice cakes, whatever. It's most important are carbohydrates. You don't need protein, and you probably don't need fats as well. It's all about the energy, and the energy you require your carbohydrates. Then the next step is recovery after the race. So we are talking about like a few days race now, when you have hard days on the water every single day, so you have to recover as quickly and as best as possible. The most important, one of the very common mistakes that sailors do is that when they finish the last race of the day, they don't eat anything, and they have like a long upwind to the club. So it can take an hour, and then they come ashore. They first get the boat ready, the boat, get changed, and only after that they start eating. And this can take like 2 hours. So it's a lot of time that was lost because no energy was ingested. So my recommendation is to have something after the last race, so that the coach can give you when you finish the race. And my recommendation usually is chocolate milk, like half a liter of chocolate milk. That's probably the best thing that you can do. You can have, but only if you're not lactose intolerant. If you have problems with milk, you can find lactose-free milk, lactose-free chocolate milk, and that will work really well. Why chocolate milk? Because it contains protein, it contains carbohydrates, it's relatively little in fat. It's great for hydration, as we will find out soon. So that's about it. Have pasta when you come to shore, a little fat, lots of protein. Next thing is breakfast. Don't forget about big breakfast. My recommendation usually is, for a cyclist at least, to have rice pudding, so that you have rice with milk, again, lactose-free milk for those that have problems with lactose. and have like something that has fructose in it. So that's type of a sugar that you can find like in fruits, or actually cacao, Nesquik or something like that. That would work really well as well. So you want to have different kinds of carbohydrates for the breakfast. Meal in the last hour before the race. So when you are sailing toward the race area, or you're waiting for the race ashore, you can obviously have something if you're feeling like it. Again, carbohydrates. Forget about fats, forget about protein. It's carbohydrates that are the most important thing. And again, it depends of whether you want that or not. So it's up to the sailor and his feelings. On the water, the recommendations, general recommendations for like endurance type of activity, which sailing I think is to have like 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. I know you can't drink during the race when you're sailing, but you have to have something in between races, in between each race. So have a bar, have something to drink with carbohydrates, have an energy gel or something, just whatever really works for you. Again, practice that during training sessions and see what works for you and what doesn't. So that's about nutrition. And the next thing I'll cover briefly is actually hydration. And I think that's a huge problem for sailors. So when you are sailing or doing any type of activity, 75% of energy that you're actually producing goes to the heat. This means that you're actually a radiator, and this heat has to go away. It has to go to the environment, or you're going to increase your body core temperature, and that's going to cause problems. Not only that, you're very likely to sail in a very hot environment, especially in the summer. You have solar radiation as a result of that. You have a high ambiental temperature, high humidity, and this all contribute to increased heat stress. So the body tries to cool itself down by sweating. So this by evaporation of sweat, you lose a lot of energy. So the sweat has to evaporate from your body. And this is can be a problem, and you are losing a lot of water as a result, so you're dehydrating. Also for sailors, you are actually wearing neoprene clothing most of the time, and this means that the sweat is even more you're sweating even higher. The rates of sweat are even bigger, and this can cause severe dehydration. So the sweat loss, sweating can vary between like 0 if you're not doing anything and you are actually in a really cold environment, and go up to like 3 liters an hour. So you're losing 3 liters of fluid each hour. Now think about a long training day on the water, and if you're like losing 1 liter and a half of sweat per hour, and you're in the water for 4 hours, think about how much fluid this is and how much you have to replace. And this is a huge problem for sailors. I hear a lot from sailors that they are losing weight over the time, over the course of the championship, for example. There has been a few studies on this topic already, and they're not losing weight because they are losing body fat. They're losing weight mostly because they're not hydrating enough. So they're not replacing the fluids they've lost during the regattas, and then it just goes on and on. So like half a liter a day, too little fluid intake means over a few days, a few kilograms of body weight. So what to do about it? The simplest solution would probably be to weigh yourself before and after each sailing day. So you can actually find out how much sweat you've lost, and multiply this number by 1.5, and that's how much you have to drink. Thus, do all beverages, so water, Coke, whatever, hydrate you equally? No. So here is a really nice graphic showing how well different beverages hydrate you. So you have coffee on the far left side, so that's the worst thing you can have for hydration in the post-race period. And the more to the right you go, the better it is. So for example, Diet Cola, sports drinks are all better than water, orange juice is better than water, and the best hydration solution is skimmed milk. So that's milk, that's the chocolate milk. So that's the reason why I recommended chocolate milk earlier. One of the reasons, at least. So that would be about the hydration. I hope I haven't complicated too much and that you've learned something new. You can always find me on Instagram. It's mostly cycling content though, but it's for science related. Or you can actually drop me an email if you have any questions. And yeah, now it's time for answering questions, I guess.
Hi, Tim. It was a very nice one. It's good to remind the people regarding their food intake. There are a couple of questions, if you can read them through, and I will just do a little bit of summary on what we've been talking about. The main thing why we are covering this subject, because in the previous topics, we were all been talking about the boat handling, the speed on the water, how we are managing our sailing, but who is doing all that stuff? It's the person who is in the boat, and that's us sailors. And the sailors have to have good fuel in their brain. Fuel is our food, yeah? So it's a critical part to be always with a quality food in our body, and then you can think properly, then you can act properly, then you can do the things properly. So that's an important subject which a lot of people are neglecting because they are always focused on the other stuff, how to go on the water, how to get the things done on the other stuff, but they forget about themselves. And this is a good reminder for us sailors that we need to take care of this stuff. And especially now when we have a lot of access for all the food, we are not thinking too much what are we eating and how much we are spending the energy. So it's a good reminder for all of us. So thank you, Tim. And now if you went through the question, can you answer them? There are just a couple of questions.
So the first one was how many days in advance I need to eat carbohydrates before the high intensity training. So there used to be a rule that you need to start filling up carbohydrate stores like 6 to 3 days in advance. I think in the last few years or like last decade, the evidence has accumulated that it's enough to eat plenty of carbohydrates only the day prior to race. So for example, if you think about cyclists, they require loads of and are eating loads of carbohydrates. They can actually fill up those stores in a single day just after the race. On each day of the Tour de France, for example. So it's about just having enough carbohydrates the day before. For example, a really good source of carbohydrates for doing for filling up the stores are actually Haribos or just any kind of products that contain purely carbohydrates, no fats, or very little protein. So that would be my recommendation. Just start filling up the stores the day before the really hard training session. So the next question is, what should I be focusing on to gain weight? I've been cycling and losing weight, especially upper body muscle in the process. So for increasing body weight, there are basically two parts. So the first one is just the mass. We'll be talking about like fat mass, or we are actually talking about increasing the protein, like the amount of muscle. For increasing the muscle mass, the most important thing is actually weight training, so kind of resistance training in the gym, and have enough protein in the process. So it's like probably around 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. More than that, you probably don't need, and you will not increase anymore your body weight. But at the same time, cycling and those endurance sports can actually cause reductions in body weight because the energy demands are so high. So you have to really make sure that you're eating enough. And here again, carbohydrates are the most important part, and you're likely not eating enough. Is monitoring diet does this help to keep in balance? I would say yes and no, or it depends. The thing is that for sailing, it's very, very difficult to actually measure how much energy you're actually expending. And it's also at the same time very difficult to actually measure how much you're having. That would require you to weigh all the foods and the things, everything you're having. So that takes a lot of time. I think the best approach is to have a broad idea of how much you're having. So like measure or weigh the food in the beginning to get an idea like what a bowl of pasta is like, how many grams of carbohydrates is that, and then you can actually just think about like, this is how much I'm going to have for like hard training session, this is how much I'm going to have for like easy training sessions, and things like that, and just experiment a bit. Really don't overcomplicate when it comes to weighing the food and monitoring the food intake. Why don't I become thirsty if I lose so much water? Yeah, thirsty is a mechanism that's a bit weird. It works funny sometimes. And actually can get severely dehydrated by listening to thirst. So that's kind of a debate that's been ongoing in the sports science field for like decades now. Not a good solution has been provided. So you just weighing yourself before and after the training session and then just replacing the fluids lost is probably the best way. You can actually also figure out how much on average you are losing, so that you can actually think about having at least approximate amount as much as possible on the water as well. So like if you're losing like 1.5 liters per hour, so that you can actually have at least like 750 milliliters of water every hour on the water, so that you can actually replace those fluids. What is your idea on supplements and powders when it comes to a vegan diet? So yeah, a vegan diet can be really problematic in my opinion if it's not well structured. So for example, even protein sources can be of low quality if you don't know what you're doing. So my recommendation would probably be that as a rule of thumb, per se not to be on a vegan diet as an athlete, that's not optimal. But if you decide to go to a vegan diet, really consult with a dietitian so that you can get all the nutrients. So for example, certain vitamins are difficult to get from a vegan diet, like vitamin B12, for example. Most vegan athletes I know supplement those. Also, like you have some really good protein powders for vegans that come from different sources and are as good as like whey protein. That's a gold standard protein. So vegan diet can be well structured, and you can have you can get everything you need. We just need to be like well thought. And it's difficult to like give recommendations now over the